Okay, folks, so we're going to pick up where we left off. So this is the second little mini video that we're going to look at for today, covering the mind-body problem and substance dualism. So in the first video, we just gave a quick review of some different positions about the mind-body problem. So remember, the mind-body problem is just trying to figure out what mental phenomena are and how they relate to the physical world. And then we ran through these views. So your first quiz, is just going to have you match names, things like substance dualism, to the right definitions. So if you go over the notes and if you look at the slides, which are just copies of these slides that I posted, you should do just fine with that. So now we're going to look at one specific view. You might hear my dog shaking in the background. Sorry for that. Okay, so substance dualism, you'll remember, is the view that mind and body consist of two fundamentally different kinds of stuff, or substances. So a substance, don't get too caught up on that word. Substance really just means a thing that can exist on its own. So it's like a fundamental part of reality. So substance dualists, people like Plato, but also people like René Descartes. You'll remember René Descartes from earlier in the semester. So they think that a substance is like a fundamental kind of stuff, right? So it's a non-physical stuff, and the body is physical stuff. So it's like there are two kinds of things that make up reality: mental stuff and physical stuff. Each is its own kind of substance. So that's the basic view that we're going to think about. And it's supposed to be a solution to the mind-body problem, right? It's the thought that, how do the mind and the body relate? Well, they are just fundamentally different kinds of things. And even though they're fundamentally different kinds of things, according to Descartes, they interact with one another, right? So events in the physical world cause us to have changes in our minds. So if I stub my toe, that's going to lead me to feel some pain, right? But also, if I make the decision to take a sip of coffee, then my arm will lift my coffee mug to my mouth, right? So that's going to be the other question of like how these things fit together, right? So at this point, Descartes is just going to argue for the view that mind and matter are fundamentally different kinds of thing. So here's his first argument. This is going to remind you of some of the things that we learned about Descartes and skepticism. You'll remember the cogito ergo sum argument. Well, in that argument, he said, we can be certain that we ourselves exist, even though we can't be certain of the existence of any material things, right? All material things could still be the illusion created by an evil deceiver, right? So Descartes says, well, this is really interesting. So we actually know about our own existence independently of the existence of anything material. And you might remember we talked about his argument about the wax, where he said, well, we intuit the nature of the wax beyond any sensory experience of it. And moreover, Descartes claimed, we are more directly aware of our minds and their natures than we are aware of the existence and natures of material beings, material objects. So keep that line of thought in mind as we look at his first argument for substance dualism, where it says, it is conceivable that I can exist without my body, so it's logically possible that I can exist without it. Okay? He then says, if it's logically possible for me to exist without my body, then having a body is not an essential feature of me. Okay? So first he's saying it's conceivable, so it's logically possible that the mind and the body are separate. And if it's logically possible, then having a body is not an essential feature of being a self, right? The idea is that things that are essential features, we can just recognize that they're built right into them. So for instance, it is an essential feature of a circle, right? If you think of any circle, the idea is that if you gave a circle a corner, it would stop being a circle. So it's logically impossible for a circle to exist with corners, right? And it's also saying that if a circle didn't have perfectly round edges equidistant from the center, because it's not logically possible for a circle to not have those features, those are an essential feature of circles. So if it's logically possible for something to exist without the other thing, then that thing is not part of its essence, right? It's necessary of a thing that if it's part of its essence, then it's not logically possible for it to exist apart from it, according to Descartes. So he then goes on and says, it is in fact inconceivable that I could exist without a mind. So he's saying that, to imagine yourself existing without a mind is really actually trying to imagine yourself not existing at all, right? He says, I am a thing. What kind of thing am I? I'm a thing that doubts and dreams and denies and wills and perceives. But if you stop doing any of those things, it's not like you would be yourself but not thinking. He thinks you would not exist at all. Your mind is what you are at the bottom of it. Descartes says that every time you think of something, you can be certain that you exist because your existence is constituted by your thought, according to Descartes. So he goes on to say that if it's impossible for me to exist without a mind, then having a mind is an essential feature of me. Right, so that seems to follow, that's like the next step, right? It's impossible you could exist without a mind, so that's part of your essence. It's what makes you you, right? Sometimes we can think about the difference between the essence of something versus an accident. Sorry, I opened up the wrong app there. Forgive me. So sometimes we can think about the difference between the essence of something and its accidents, right? So the thought here is that an essence is something that's always there in it. And if you get rid of that thing, so the essence of something so here's the classic example. We say, imagine Socrates, right? Now, in the summertime, Socrates spends a lot of time in the sun, and he gets tanned, right? But then, in the winter, he doesn't spend much time in the sun at all, and he gets really pale and pasty. We would say that, Socrates changes in this way. He goes from tanned to pasty, but what he doesn't do is stop existing through those changes, right? So we want to say like the tone of Socrates' skin is just an accident. But, and here's the thought, is that some parts of Socrates are part of his essence, right? So the thought is that Socrates' rationality. If you got rid of Socrates' rationality, you would destroy Socrates. That's an essential feature of Socrates, right? Now, Descartes doesn't go in for this view about rationality. Descartes simply says that thought is the essential property of you, right? As soon as you get rid of thought, you cease to exist. But it means that having a mind is an essential property of me, and I am an immaterial thinking thing. Because, remember, having a body is not an essential feature of me. You could get rid of my body, but as long as there's still thought going on, you still exist. So that's Descartes' first argument. Now, Vaughan gives us Theodore Schick's criticism of the conceivability argument. So Schick's basic point is that premise 1 is actually false. He says that it is not actually conceivable that you can exist without a body. Now remember, it's not just to say like you could exist even if you had one arm removed. It's that it's impossible to imagine yourself as an immaterial being. Because if you were an immaterial being, not only would you not have any physical attributes, but you wouldn't have any location in any physical space. So the thought here is that existing in physical space is part of what it is to be a material being. According to Descartes, Descartes tells us that being a material being is all about are essentially extended beings, right? So what does that mean? Well, an extended being is just a being that takes up space, that has, dimensionality such that it takes up a certain amount of room and that it also excludes other objects from that space, is the thought. Now, the thought is that if some hypothetical being is in any space, it is extended. And if it is extended, then it is a physical thing. So Descartes' view is that minds, thought, is not extended at all. And we're going to get to that a little bit more in a moment. So thought is not extended at all, and that means that it doesn't have any physical location. Schick is going to say, actually, you can't imagine yourself having thought without those thoughts occurring in some physical space. So either Descartes is wrong to say that being a material being is essentially about being extended, or we're going to have to say, and this is more plausible, or as an interpretation of Schick's criticism, is the thought that conceiving that you can exist without your body is actually impossible. Every time you try to think about yourself existing, you think about yourself as a being, in space, in time, in a place. So we might also ask, can you think of other ways of challenging the argument? So for instance, if it's logically possible for me to exist without my body, then having a body is not an essential feature of me. Well, the idea there is that could you imagine something without something that's essential to it? And the thought might be, maybe. Because we might think that maybe being a mammal is an essential property of a dog, right? But you might meet somebody who, strangely, doesn't realize that dogs are mammals and necessarily so. Why not say, you might be a necessarily physical being, even though you don't realize it? So that might be another way of pushing a critique against Descartes' argument. And we might also wonder, like, is it really inconceivable that you could exist without a mind? Right? Or if it's impossible to imagine something without another thing, then that thing is an essential feature. Again, we might start to wonder about this. Now that we know that an essential feature is a thing that makes it what it is, we might start to wonder, can we imagine something such that when we imagine it, we always imagine another thing going along with it, but which is not an essential feature of it? So for instance, you can't imagine a mountain without imagining a valley, but mountains are one thing and valleys are another thing. Maybe they always go together, but they're also separate and arguably not essential to each other. So that's Descartes' first argument for substance dualism, the view that mind and material things are fundamentally different. Let's look at his next argument. Remember, I said that we were going to come back to this idea that for Descartes, material things are essentially extended things, right? So an extended thing is just a thing that exists in three-dimensional space that takes up room, right? So here is Descartes' idea. He says, material objects are infinitely divisible. 2, the mind is completely indivisible. And then 3, if two things are one and the same, then they have exactly the same properties. So, according to Descartes, the mind and material things are not one and the same, because mind is indivisible and material things are divisible. And if they were the same thing, then they couldn't be both, right? They would have to be either completely indivisible or they would be divisible. And in the case of material objects, not only are they divisible, they're infinitely divisible. So Louis Vaughan tells us that, well, actually, Descartes made a mistake in claiming that the mind is completely indivisible, because what about split personality disorders? Or what about the fact that you have brain-splitting cases? So the idea of brain-splitting cases, this is pretty interesting. It's the idea that some people, to prevent seizures, right, will have the left lobe and the right lobe of their brain separated surgically, right? But what happens to these people is that they can be thinking separate thoughts at the same time. So there's been one story about a guy who has the two hemispheres of his brain split apart, and with one arm he's pulling his wife towards him for a hug, and the other hand is pushing her away. So literally, it seems like there's like two completely separately functioning parts of his mind. So we've got split personality disorders, and we've also got brain splitting, hemispheric splitting cases as well. So that might raise some trouble for Descartes' claim in premise 2, that the mind is completely indivisible. Let's speak up for Descartes for a second on this argument. We might wonder what Descartes should say here. And the thought, here's how I would try to defend Descartes a little bit. So you might say that, what is it for a material object to be completely indivisible? Well, if we go back to my coffee cup, right? You know, this is like a certain size. Let's say that this is, you know, like a 4-inch tall coffee cup. Well, the thought is we could take this and we could split it in half, right? So we could chop it down to half its height, and now it's a 2-inch tall coffee cup. And then we could split it down to half that height, and then we'd have, you know, a 1-inch coffee cup, and then we could split that down to half that, and we'd get half an inch. And then if we split that down yet again, we'd have 1/4 of an inch. And we could just keep on doubling that divisor, right? You go to half an inch to 1/4 inch, 1/4 inch to 1/8 of an inch, 1/8 of an inch to 1/16 of an inch, 1/16 of an inch to 1/32 of an inch, to 1/64 to 128th, to 256th, and so on, and so on, and so on, right? So the idea is, for any material thing, you can always cut it in half. So there's always an infinite amount of division or divisibility that you have in material substance and its size, right? We can always take extension and make it smaller by dividing it. But can you do that kind of thing with thought? And Descartes is going to tell us no in that case. You know, we could imagine the shade of blue. Just imagine yourself thinking of that shade of blue on my coffee cup, right? Now the thought is, you know, experience for Descartes is what thought is. Now the experience of the shade of blue, not only can you not cut it in half once, you can never cut it in half, right? It's not that you can't divide it infinitely. It's that you can't even divide it once. A thought is just a thing itself, and we can't bisect it in physical space. Even if you can bisect a brain and have some thoughts going on over here and some thoughts going on over there, the thoughts themselves are not divisible. And so if thoughts themselves are not divisible, they are completely unlike material objects. And that would seem to save Descartes' argument. You know, premise 3 seems like it's a logical truth, right? If two things are one and the same, then they have exactly the same properties. So to take one example, Donald Trump is identical to the current president of the United States, right? So those are one and the same thing. And then we say, well, if there's anything that's true of the current president of the United States, it's just necessarily true of Donald Trump. So the thought would be that if it's the case that the current president of the United States is over 6 feet tall, then Donald Trump is also over 6 feet tall. So that's how that's how this point is supposed to work. If two names pick out the very same thing, then whatever's true of the one name is also true of the other name. This principle is sometimes referred to as Leibniz's law. So Leibniz was a famous philosopher who pointed this out in an axiomatic way. He actually comes a little bit after Descartes. But it's just that if two things are the same thing, they have all the same properties. That'll be something for you to think about. Maybe you're persuaded by Vaughan's case that multiple personality disorders, or maybe points about the modularity of the mind. This is a thought defended by people like Freud, you know, that your mind is divided into the id, the ego, and the superego. Is that sort of division of the modules of the mind, does that give us a reason to doubt Descartes' view? is it the same thing as that individual thoughts are completely indivisible? And if that were right, would that be enough to show that individual thoughts are unlike material objects in terms of their divisibility? So there we go. We've got two arguments for substance dualism. We'll just finish up by looking at a challenge for the substance dualist. So materialists think, so a materialist, remember, is a substance monist, right? So dualism, two, monism just means one. So the materialist will tell us that Cartesian dualism cannot explain the interactions between the mind and the body. So materialists are going to ask, how can a non-physical substance, for instance, an intention, give rise to changes in physical substances? So, you have an intention to raise your arm, and then it causes a physical event, right? So we might also wonder how a physical event, for instance, stubbing my toe, can give rise to a non-physical event, for instance, a feeling of pain, right? So Descartes explained this interaction between, physical events and mental events back to physical events as sort of mediated by a little part of the brain. He noticed that every part of the brain had a left side and a right side, right? So the brain kind of has that cleft in the middle. He noticed that the pineal gland was like one gland right in the middle that didn't have like a left half, right half thing. It was just right there in the middle. So that's where he thought everything sort of came together in the brain. But, the pineal gland itself is still just a physical thing, right? So it still doesn't explain how a non-physical thing, like an idea, we might also think of like other non-physical things like a song or a mathematical law, how those things could give rise to a change in physical reality. So many materialists, and in your textbook, John Searle is one of those advocates who looks at this, says, here's something that we know from physics. It's this claim called the causal closure of the physical. And it's the view that the world is a closed system of physical causes and effects. And the thought here is that every physical event has a traceable physical cause, and that the universe always has the exact same amount of matter and energy in it at any time. It's always conserved. But if the mind is causing events to happen, that breaks this law of conservation of energy. So the thought is that you would have to be breaking the laws of physics every time mind, insofar as it's a non-physical substance, makes a change on the physical world. So that's going to be one challenge. How does the mind interact with the body? What explains that interaction? And how do we make sense of that thing? That sort of thing, I should say. So that's sort of our first view that we've seen in the philosophy of mind, substance dualism. We've got minds and we've got matter. They're fundamentally different kinds of things. We saw two arguments, right? We saw the conceivability argument, that you can imagine your mind existing without a body, so therefore a body is not part of the essence of you and your existence. And then we have this other argument about divisibility, right? You can divide a physical thing infinitely many times, but you can't divide a thought, not even once. And then we also looked at this challenge about substance dualism, saying that non-physical substances, unless we want to go against everything we know according to physics, shouldn't be able to cause physical events. So if you accept the causal closure of the physical, then you shouldn't think that minds are fundamentally different, non-physical, separate things. So I'll leave you to think about that, and we'll start looking at materialist theories of the mind, starting with the identity theory, I believe, next time around. So thanks for listening in, and we'll talk to you soon. All right, take care. Bye.